we go. There we go. There we go. That was so great. I couldn't have scripted that better. The reason we want to get kind of full of energy today is because we're talking about a really fantastic topic. We're really excited about our Christmas season this year, and we're going to be talking about being home for Christmas. And you know, for most of us, you know, and I hope that this is your experience. I know it's not true for everybody, but I think for a lot of us, you know, home and Christmas kind of go together, and we have those memories of childhood. And sometimes, even if you didn't have the greatest childhood growing up, there's a certain memory you maybe have of Christmas, and you know, that you can hold on to, and that feeling of belonging, that feeling of love, that feeling of togetherness, you know, is something that we want to talk about. Now, if you haven't ever experienced that, then this is even a better topic, because really what we want to talk about is, how do you really come home for Christmas? How do you make that future for yourself where you really have come home? Because home is a really important concept biblically, and it's a really important concept in our lives, and it's something that really, Christmas is just a great time to talk about it. And so that's what we've been talking about over the next few weeks here, and we really are excited about this. We want to give you all an opportunity to be a part of what we're doing here for Christmas. And so what we're asking everybody to do is we're asking you to share your Christmas memories of home. Right? And that could be, you know, the family that you had when you were, you know, growing up, and the family that you had as a child. It can be the family that you have as an adult. But share your memories with us. And so, you know, you can put a comment on any of our Facebook posts or anything like that, our social media posts. You can email that to us. You can write it on a scrap of paper. You can crayon it on a napkin. Put it in the offering box. Email it to us, whatever it is that you can do, or even just take a quick selfie video of telling the story, whatever it is you want to do. But we want to have those memories that we can share with one another of this season. We're going to be in Philippians chapter 2 today, so if you'd like to turn there, Philippians chapter 2. It'll be a great place for us to start. Now, we have covered this passage before, but we want to look at it under a little bit different light today. We want to look at a little bit different angle with it. Philippians chapter 2 is a great passage because it really tells us about who Jesus is and what he does and how he brings home to us. And so Philippians chapter 2, you know, one of the things that's really fascinating about the Bible is the story of us not going out and finding God, but it's about God finding us. It's about God making his home among us. That's what happened in the Old Testament. If you look at Abraham and the promises of Abraham, you look at Israel and God giving them the 10 Commandments, giving them all the instructions to make the tabernacle and the temple. Really what God was doing was he was preparing a home for the people and himself, because home is where God is and you are. Home is that's the ultimate family. And so God basically tells the Israelites, I'm going to make my home among you. I'm going to tabernacle among you. And he makes that happen. And he's with them, and they are his people, and he is their God. And you think, wow, what an amazing thing. And that is an amazing thing. And the Jewish people were rightfully proud of that. But that was only a precursor. It was only a foreshadowing of how he would really make his home with us. And that happened when Jesus came to earth. And that's what we celebrate for the Christmas season. We celebrate God making his home with us. And so when we look at Philippians chapter 2, it's going to explain some of the theological aspects and implications of Jesus making his home with us. So I invite you to join us. Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. It says, so if there is any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Now, there's a couple of things that are very fascinating about that passage from this perspective of understanding how Jesus comes and makes his home with us. Because we would think to ourselves, well, this isn't a very complicated thing, right? If you want to go and make your home with somebody, I mean, there's a number of ways you can do that. You can sneak into their house and kind of live in the attic unaware, right? I mean, that is one of the options. I wouldn't suggest that, but that's something you could do. You could become a roommate. You can be adopted into the family. There's a number of ways, and so we think, well, that shouldn't be too difficult for God to make his home with us. But it was a much more difficult thing than we understand. Because of the difference, the separation between God and us, because of our sin, it was actually not easy for Jesus to come and make his home with us. And so this passage is explaining a lot of what Jesus had to do, the price that's paid, and the steps that are necessary, and the implications of Jesus making his home with us. We're going to look at three things today. We're going to look at how home has an inside and an outside. We're going to look at how home has an up and a down. And we're going to look at how home has a center. This is a very three-dimensional sermon. You guys are probably getting that, huh? You're doing the math and you're figuring out it's very three-dimensional. So let's look at this idea that home has an inside and an outside. The first thing that is kind of revealed in this passage is that there is a family that is far more old, far more significant, far more established than we might suspect. And that happens down in verse 11. It says, every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. Now, how many of you guys know that God is the Father? Anyone? God has one of the aspects, one of the persons of the Trinity is the Father. You guys know that, right? Isn't it interesting that we have this word Father that we use every day, and yet it really comes from something that is so far beyond our experience that it's really hard for us to understand or categorize it. You see, God is actually the person, the model for the creation of the family. In Ephesians chapter 3, verse 14 and 15, it says, for this reason I bow my knees before the Father. Okay, that makes sense, right? How many of you guys pray? Anyone here, any prayers? Do we have any prayers here? Okay. You pray, when you pray, do you pray to God the Father? Yeah, I think most of us do, right? We pray to God the Father. And what's interesting is here in this, he's saying, for this reason I bow my knees before the Father. That's great. You're bowing your knees before the Father. But what doesn't usually stand out with us is that word Father and how strong of a word that is and the implications of calling God Father. For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named. That's a really powerful statement. That every family is named after God. Every single family that's ever existed on earth is named after God. You see, the family structure is not something that's just a convenience. It's not something that's just, it'll do for now, or we haven't thought of anything better. There's all these movements that have happened over time where people have decided we need to get rid of the nuclear family because it's the problem. And the idea here is a fascinating one because the idea that we have is that the family actually comes from the person of God. It's represented by the fact that in God in the Trinity, you have a Father, you have a Son, and you have a Spirit. You have a family structure within the Trinity itself. And so when we create families, when we participate in families, if we're doing it according to the image of the Father, then we're participating with God. There is Father, Son, and Spirit eternal, And so therefore there is something necessary and something good and something holy and something glorious about the family. Now, what's really fascinating is you might say to yourself, well, I had a family growing up. Maybe that family was good, maybe that family wasn't. I don't know, for each one of you what your particular story is. But you might say to yourself, well, as an adult, I don't have that anymore. And you might think, well, that's in my past. This sermon doesn't really apply to me. But I want you to know that this sermon might apply more to you than to anybody else here. Because what God shows is that He can create a family from nothing, from death. In Hebrews chapter 11, we know that Hebrews is the faith chapter, right? Everybody has that in their mind, right? When we say Hebrews 11, you go, oh, that's the faith chapter. And because it's one of the most, famous chapters in all of the book of Hebrews and the most recognizable, because it goes on and it lists all these people in the Old Testament, all the faith that they had, and how faith is so important. But notice in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 11 and 12, it says, by faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of the sand by the seashore. What is this telling us? This is telling us something that's incredibly important. Why is it that so often in the Bible we find a woman who's having trouble conceiving, and that's the person that God chooses in order to bless? Because what we had, remember when Abraham and Sarah were being chosen and going through this process of being called by God into a covenant and being blessed, God said, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make you this great nation. Well, first they had to be a family. And that was a problem. You're 100 years old and you don't have kids yet. That's kind of a problem if you're going to be made into a great nation. And if you remember, the idea was by Abraham, he was like, well, maybe it's through maybe it's through my servant. Maybe my servant should be my heir. Or maybe I should have children through a servant. Maybe that's how God's going to work this out. And God was like, no, that's not how I'm going to work it out. And what happened was, miraculously, God brought about this situation where He was able to create family. Because He is spirit, and even though the flesh wasn't able to create family, He was able to do that. Why does God want to show us that? Because He wants to show us something very powerful and very important. That family is first of all not physical but spiritual. And because family is first of all spiritual, God is able to create family where none physically exists. And so if you've been in a situation where you say, I'm at the place in my life that this is not an option for me, I can't do this, I'm telling you that God has the power to bring home for you. He has the power to bring home for you this Christmas. You have the opportunity to be home for Christmas. You have the ability and the power because God has the ability and power, and God gives to us generously and richly. Now, am I saying that you're just going to as you leave today, as you leave the sermon, you're going to go home? If you don't have a family, you're going to go home, you're going to open the door, and there they are. Amazon delivered, right? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that family is a spiritual thing before it's a physical thing. What does that mean? You've either experienced in your life or you've known a family that even though biologically they were connected, spiritually they weren't. And if you had to choose between a family that was connected biologically but not spiritually, and one that was connected spiritually but not biologically, which one would you choose? Which one would you choose? Because the thing is that there are some people who act like family even though they're not family. That the love and the sacrifice and the unity and the appreciation all the things that we want, the warmth, the accept, all those things that we want, that there are people who have that even though they're not biologically connected, and there are people who are biologically connected who don't have any of that. And we know which one we would rather be a part of. And the thing is this is what is possible because of God. You can create, through the power of the Spirit, you can create those connections that are family by spirit, even if you don't have a family physically. God works through families. Notice that in the Bible, God doesn't start with a nation, but He makes families out of individuals. And family is a spiritual reality from the beginning. Family is a spiritual reality. It's an idea. It's an ideal. It's something that we hold up. It's something that we strive to attain. It's something that we desire, and we know it even if we don't see it. We know, we have a conception of it. We know that it's possible and that it's there. And what God does is He makes many from one by making one from many. So He takes this guy Abraham and He makes a promise to him. And through this one man, He makes many because He made many out of one. What He did was He took a whole bunch of individuals and He collected them and He made them into a family. And by doing that, He made one person many. What is a family? Well, a family has an inside and an outside. What do we mean by that? When you're part of a family, this is so important for us to understand. There's a boundary there. There's, like if you buy a house, so let's say you guys, how many of you guys like touring model homes? Anybody here like doing that? I used to like that. Now they're so far away to get to a model home. I can't be bothered. But, back in the day when they were a little closer, easier to get to, I used to enjoy going to model homes, and they set them up with all the furniture and stuff. One of the things that you never think about is all of those model homes, they all come with something that we just don't think about. They all come with walls. Can you imagine if you went to a model home and all the furniture was laid out and everything, but there were no walls? Is that something that you would be interested in? How many of you would enjoy that, having a house with no walls? Right? What's the purpose of a wall? The purpose of a wall is to make sure that the inside and the outside are distinct, because that's part of what makes family family. Now, the problem is that when we're teenagers, this is both a curse and a blessing, and we really kind of chafe, in the midst of this. Right? How many of you guys had rules when you were a kid? Did you enjoy those rules? How many of you guys had rules? I was listening to a comedian last night, and he was talking about how back when we were kids, we had all kinds of rules, and that he was one of the older kids in his family, and that he would go home. And like his parents were super strict, and he would go home, and all of a sudden, like he would see his younger siblings, and it's like the parents, I think that this happens. I think that parents, especially when they have big families, they just lose energy. I don't know if any of you have a lot of kids, that maybe you can comment that's true, but they lose energy, and by the time the last kid is raised, there's just no rules at all. And if you were one of the older kids, man, that's a tough pill to swallow, right? Because you had all of those rules. Now, here's the thing, is that when you were a kid, did you like those rules? How many of you guys did? You liked the rules? No? I don't see a single hand. That might be the first time. Not a single hand's going. Oh, Mark, was that you back there? Did you have your hand up? Is that true? Oh, you were reaching for your cup. That makes a lot more sense. So here's the thing, like when you were growing up, you hated the rules. You know who didn't have the rules? Somebody who wasn't in the family. You see, the rules were there for you because you were part of the family. And there's a difference between being inside the family and being outside of the family. And the one who had to follow the rules was the one who was inside the family. I remember growing up as a kid, like one of the things that was non-negotiable, my dad was a pastor, one of the things that was non-negotiable is we couldn't miss church on Sunday. And I had so many opportunities. My friends would be going, oh, we're going on a camping trip, we're going on this, we're going on that. And I would ask my parents, hey, can I do this? And they'd say, are you going to be back for church on Sunday? And they would say, and if I said no, they would say, nope, you can't go. You can't go. And I would get so upset. Well, they get to do it. Well, but they're outside the family. There's a difference between inside and outside. You know, the idea of a family from the ancient times is descent from the same father. And there's a way that you can have descent from the same father. There's a couple of different ways. And they kind of recognize this throughout the ancient world. And it's maybe best summed up, and it came to its kind of fullness back in the Roman world, where they had two different words for the home. Two different words. One was the familia, right? And that meant the family, the biological people who were descended from the same father, the familia. But they also had another word, and that was the domus. And the domus was the household. Now, both of these could be referring to what we call home. You could say the familia, or you could say the domus, and they had two words for the same thing that we have one word for, the home. Why is it that you can have two different words? Because they recognize something very important, that being descended from the same father could happen biologically or it could happen spiritually. And the marker for spiritual descent from the same father is, did you obey the rules? Did you conform to what the father desired? And so if you were a servant, you would be part of the domus, even though you weren't part of the familia, because even though you weren't biologically descended, because you came under the same authority, because you obeyed the same father, because you abided by the same rules, you were part of the domus. You were considered part of the household. When Abraham was called, he was called to leave his father. He was called to leave his family and his nation. Because if you're going to make a new family, you have to step outside of the old one. And I can't tell you how important this is. Man, we really want for all of us as a congregation to be home this Christmas. And what that means is we want Jesus to make his home with us. This Christmas, you know, you've had a lot of Christmases, all of you guys had, but this Christmas, we want all of us together as a church family to focus on making our home with Jesus more real in our lives this year. And I hope that you can take that on as a goal. That you can say, you know what, maybe I had a lot of ideas for Christmas or what's going on, but you know what, maybe there's nothing more important than making my home with Jesus this year more real than it's ever been. But in order to do that, you have to leave, like Abraham did, you have to leave your father's household. What does that mean? It means that there is already, all of us came from a family. All of us conformed to a father. And that was the devil. All of us were children of the devil at some point in our lives. All of us were alienated from God. All of us were in rebellion against God. All of us had a different father. And the thing is that the more real Jesus making his home with us, the more real God the Father being our Father in our life, in order to make that happen, that means we have to leave our old family. We have to leave our old ideas of what family meant. How many of you guys have some funny stories of family that involve things that maybe weren't exactly what you would want a family to be? Anyone have those stories? Like things going on, things happening, things, maybe there was some chaos in the family. Maybe somebody was upset about something. Maybe, any of you guys have those stories? Like your family was, can we be honest here? All of our families were kind of dysfunctional in their own special way. Can we say that? Can we say that? As a dad, I can look back and say the family that I provided for my children, it was dysfunctional in its own special way. And we have some funny stories about kind of home that involve us not, maybe not being our best. I remember one story that my dad always used to tell. And my grandmother was a very small, very petite, very feminine woman. She went to the hairdresser every week. You know the type? She went to the hairdresser every week, but man, did she have a temper. You would never guess by looking at her. But one of the things my cousins used to like to do, we played this game all the time as a family called Aggravation. Can you see where this is going? They would have, they had their own game within the game, and that game was who can get grandma to say a swear word first? Who can make her so angry, so upset? She was not a swearer. But man, when she got really upset, when she got really mad, you could get it out of her. And so that was the game within the game. And what happened, my dad was telling this story one time, and my grandma, when he would tell the story, she would relive her moment of anger. My dad had done something that he wasn't supposed to do, and not only that, but when my grandma called him on it, He gave her some kind of attitude. He gave her it was like he was getting to the point where he was too big to spank. And she got so angry that she grabbed a yardstick. And this wasn't one of those flimsy flop. This was like an old school yardstick, like that kind that would survive a nuclear blast. And she picked up that thing, and he said she was so angry, and he was laughing at her. And that made her more angry. And so she grabbed that yardstick and she went after him and she smacked him across the bottom with that thing. And the end of the yardstick broke off. That's how hard she hit him. And he saw that break and he started laughing. Like he was already laughing, but he started laughing again at the sight of this. And she got so angry that she hit him again. And the end of it broke off again. And so now my dad's just like, he's in stitches. He's rolling. He is so, this is hilarious to him. And he says that she's mad, getting madder and madder. And every time she gets madder, she hits him again. And the yardstick gets shorter and shorter until by the end of it, she's trying to hit him with something less than a ruler. And it's having no effect. But in her anger, she can't stop doing it. And he's laughing the whole time. Now that was a picture of the family maybe not going as well as it could have. Maybe that wasn't everybody's best moment. You see, the thing is that there's a way of being in family that comes naturally to us. And if we're going to really make Jesus our home this year, we're going to have to give up some of those things. Is there anybody here, you don't have to raise your hand, but just ask yourself this question. Is there anybody here that maybe has some anger that they could let go of? Like maybe Jesus would be more at home. Maybe you'd be more at home with him if you gave up some of that. Maybe there's other things going on in your life, but that's what we need to look at this year. Because family has an inside and an outside, and we don't want to be on the outside of family. Family is a very fascinating topic throughout Scripture. In John chapter 10, verse 22, it says, "At that time, the Feast of Dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the colonnade of Solomon. So the Jews gathered around him and said to him, 'How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly.'" You see, they didn't like the fact that there was followers that were coming around Jesus and that he had gained all this popularity. And so they were looking for something to kind of hang him with. They were looking for an excuse to get rid of him. He's like, just tell us plainly that you're the Christ. And in verse 25 it says, Jesus answered them, "I told you and you do not believe." He's basically saying, I've already told you. I've already told you and you don't believe. "The works that I do in my Father's name bear witness about me." What is he saying? How has Jesus already told them that he's the Christ? How has he done that? By the way that he lived his life as an exact representation of the Father. How does God become our Father? How does Jesus make his home with us? When our lives are conformed to him. When our lives are conformed to him. Just as He was the Son because he was the exact representation of the Father. Jesus is saying, everything that I've done, and literally, if you could take a microscope to Jesus' life, if you could record every second of what he did on earth, every single thing conformed to the Father. And so it told you whose Son he was. That is how Jesus makes his home with us, the same way that Jesus had a home with the Father. Tell us plainly, I told you and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name bear witness about me, but you do not believe because you are not among my sheep. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand. I and the Father are one. How is it that Jesus makes his home with us? The same way his home was with the Father. He and the Father are one. And when we and Jesus are one, we're at home with him. You know, he's saying there's no separation between me and my Father. There's an identity that's shared here. That's the same way that it works in the family. I am a Williamson. My sons are a Williamson. There is a shared identity. There is a oneness that comes from that. And the more that oneness is made manifest between us, the more that home exists for us. Because here's the thing, when you have Jesus, when you're more at home with Jesus, you're making real home in your life. In all the relationships that you have, home is becoming more real the more that you are conformed to Jesus. The more you are at home with Jesus, the more you are at home with everybody around you. And that's what we want to be real this year. So home has an up and a down. Home is an up and a down. Now, one of the things that's fascinating is you can see this idea of an in and out and the identity, even in things like chapter 2 of Philippians, like verse 2, complete my joy by having the same mind. You see this idea? There's this unity that gets there. And so there's an inside and an outside all through this Philippians passage, but there's also an up and a down, and that's what we want to look at. Like, look at verses 6 and 7 of Philippians 2. It says, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. Now, what is that saying? Not only is there an in and an out, Jesus wants us to have the same mind. He wants us to be conformed to him as he is conformed to the Father, but that there's an up and a down, and Jesus is saying that up and the down doesn't look like what we often think it looks like. This is often called the kenotic passage, and it comes from this idea of emptying. He emptied himself. And there's a lot of debate among theologians, well, what does that really mean? And there was, for a while, there was this idea that became kind of popular in theological circles. It was called kenoticism. And that meant that how does Jesus become man? How does God become man? And the idea was, well, he emptied himself of everything of God that wouldn't fit inside of a man. You know, how many of you guys, when you were a kid, you had Play-Doh? You guys remember Play-Doh? And Play-Doh wasn't that great of a toy, but they made all those accessories. That's how it's big Play-Doh, right? You know, you have big tobacco, you have big pharmaceutical, big Play-Doh. How did big Play-Doh, how did they get us? Well, they got us by producing a toy that in itself isn't that fun. You had to buy all the accessories. You guys remember that? And so you had these accessories, and a lot of them had to do with like smashing something into the Play-Doh, and everything that didn't fit kind of went away, right? It got left out. That's kind of what this kenoticism view was, is that everything that didn't, there's a form of a man, and then you have all this God, and like you smash that form of a man into God, and all the things that don't fit into man, that kind of got left out. Well, people have kind of realized that that's probably not a very good way of understanding this. And so one of the things that they look at is this idea that Jesus assumed humanness. And it didn't involve loss as much as it involved a choice of what you won't do. How many of you guys have seen that show Undercover Boss? Anyone seen that? Right? And so what happens is the boss, he puts on some kind of makeup or something, and he goes and he works the regular shift, right? He works with all the people in the company, and he does, he's packing boxes, doing that stuff. Now, does the boss stop becoming the boss when he's like sweeping the floor? Is he not the boss anymore? Could he be fired by somebody else in the company? If somebody else in the company, like if his supervisor said, I don't think you're doing a good job sweeping the floor, you're fired. Could that happen? And he's like, man, I knew this was a bad idea. Now I'm out of the company completely. No, that's not going to happen, right? Because even though he's sweeping the floor, he's still the boss. Now, does that mean that he doesn't have all the things to do that a sweeping of the floor person has to do? Does it mean that he's not fully invested in sweeping the floor? No, he's got to do that. That's his job. He's got to fulfill that. He's got to do that. But there are certain aspects of being a boss that he gives up and he chooses not to use while he's doing that. You see, Jesus didn't stop being God. So the idea is here, when he emptied himself to become a human being, he didn't stop being God while that happened. What he did was he chose not to use a lot of the privileges that he has, a lot of the glory that he has. He doesn't hold on to those things. He doesn't say, you know what, I must be seen as the boss. I must have the privilege of the boss. As I'm sweeping the floor, I must have my secretary from the executive suite come and bring me my coffee in the morning. What does that show us about this up and down? It shows us that when you don't consider it something to be grasped or held onto, that what you're demonstrating is that this hierarchy exists for the good of the whole. In John chapter 17, it says in verse 1 and 2, when Jesus had spoken these words, he lifted up his eyes to heaven and said, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you, since you have given him authority over all flesh, to give eternal life to all whom you have given him. You've given him all authority over all flesh. Jesus has all authority over everything. And yet, when he was a kid, when he was growing up, even in his life in the world, what did he do? When people came to him and said, well, should we pay the taxes or should we not pay the taxes? He said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. He didn't say, hey man, I'm the boss here. I'm not listening to you. But what happened was that he understood something very important, which was that this hierarchy, this up and down in the family, exists for the good of the whole family. And he's willing to lay down a lot of the prerogatives of his position being higher for the good of those who are underneath him. So let me ask you this question. You can agree or disagree. Children are the least important part of the family. Agree or disagree? Children are the least important part of the family. Agree or disagree? Shout it out. So we have some agree, we have some disagree. All right, let's fight. All right. So here's the thing. It's a trick question, isn't it? What does it mean to be least important? Well, it's interesting because if you had a family without children or you had children without a family, which one of those things would function better and survive better? Man, we've seen Lord of the Flies, right? We know the answer to this. Right? A family with all children in it would not function very well. It would be something of a disaster. It would not function near as well as a family without children. And yet we also understand that the family exists for the children and for the purpose of allowing them to grow up and to be functioning adults. The family exists in its nature to help bring them into glory. And so, on the one hand, you can say children are the purpose of the family, and on the other hand, you can say adulthood is the purpose of the family. You see what I'm getting at? Because children are the reason for the family, but bringing them into adulthood, bringing them into functioningness as an adult is the purpose of that. You see the point? The point is that the hierarchy exists for a purpose. And when you understand that, when you understand that the home has an up and down, and that up and down is good, but it's good in its own purpose and its own functioning, and that you can give up those things in order to make that functioning even better, then what happens is you end up with a strong family. And Jesus is the ultimate example of that. And as Jesus makes his home in your life, you will be better and better at doing that in your own family. But the final thing we need to talk about is that home has a center. In chapter 2 of Philippians, verse 8, it says, "And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross." This point of death is the center of the home. The center of a home is important because what happens in the center of the home is everybody is gathered around that. It becomes the place of unity, the place of drawing together, the place of communion in a family. There's an interesting story in Genesis chapter 37. There's a story of a family, and this family gets torn apart. And it's interesting because the thing that is the center brings it back together. Let's look at Genesis chapter 37, verse 7. Now, this is a statement that is not seen by the people who received it as being very helpful. Let's just say that. Genesis 37:7 says, "Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood straight up, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." You guys remember what this is? This is Joseph's dream. Can you imagine saying this to your family? You know, I had this dream, and all of us were represented by sheaves of wheat. And, you know, the interesting thing about that, I got to tell you about this dream. It's so fascinating. It's so neat. So what happened was, my sheaf is like standing up in the middle. It's like the center of everything. And then all of your sheaves bowed down to it. Isn't that weird? Yeah, that doesn't go over very well in families. I would suggest you don't kind of tell that kind of story. But the point here is a fascinating one, right? Because the family is gathered around this center sheaf. And the center sheaf is, it's Joseph, right? It's Joseph. And you say to yourself, well, gosh, man, that's so like egotistical. Now, here's the thing. It's not about him as a person. Think about the story. What happens? What happens is, remember, his brothers don't like him, and so they throw him into a pit, and he gets taken and sold into slavery, and he goes into prison, and, you know, he's every time he seems to be getting ahead in life, something happens, not from his own problems, but then he goes and he gets, every time he rises up, something not of his doing happens, and he ends up falling even further. He falls into slavery. He's in Potiphar's house. He rises to the top of Potiphar's house. Potiphar's wife likes him too much, and he ends up falling down into prison. Now he's at the very bottom, like you can't get any worse than that. And it's interesting because when he gets thrown into a pit, the idea of being in the earth, in the ancient world, that represented being dead. And so it's like his brother, and in fact, remember his brothers tell his dad that he's dead. All of this story, it's about him. He dies. And then he goes through this death experience, and through that, what happens is God blesses him. He's faithful, and so what happens is he gets elevated to being second in all authority in all of Egypt. And you remember that his family is starving, and so years later, they go down to Egypt because they're trying to buy some grain. And he has this opportunity to take and really get them. He can use his power and he can use his position to really get them back. Man, I don't know about you guys, but in a lot of families, and in families, in my extended family, there is some bad blood. And the idea of, like, let's hope for a situation where we can use our position to get back at them, that's not unheard of. This is the situation with Joseph. He's basically gone down to death. And now he's been elevated to this great position. And the question is, how will he use that position? And it looks like he's really going to get them. He sets up that whole thing where it looks like they're stealing something so that he can basically get them in trouble. And then he reveals himself to them. And man, they know that this is a bad situation. They know that they've done him wrong. They know that their life depends on him. They know that without what he can give them, they're dead. They're powerless, and he is powerful. And you remember what he says to them? What you meant for evil, God meant for good. In that moment, what he shows is something very, very powerful. That he accepts the fatherhood of what God has done in his life. He accepts that this was given as a blessing, that the pain that he endured, the quote-unquote death that he went through, all those things, that was God's way of enabling him to be in the position to bless his family, to ensure the survival of his family. There is a life for his family because he has accepted the death that he was given. And rather than hold on to a grudge, he sees the opportunity to be a blessing, and he takes it. That's the center of home. That is the center of home. Jesus was willing to obey his Father even to death on a cross so that we could be blessed. And if you allow Jesus to make his home with you, and that kind of attitude, that kind of love becomes the center of your life, then everyone around you will start experiencing home in you. You can come home this Christmas. Joseph was raised up to save his family, and you can be raised up to save yours.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to his church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.